this is David Wilner.
I'm Barnea Levy-Sullivan.
This is the LandMinds podcast brought to you by Foundation Stone. We have a very interesting guest with us today in our virtual studio. Barnea, who are we talking with?
We're talking to Professor Christopher Rollston, who is at the Department of Classical Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at George Washington University and is an epigrapher. I'm going to let Professor Rollston explain what an epigrapher is. And there has been a lot of news this month about forgeries. And Professor Rollston is capable of sharing with us his take on this issue. Professor Rollston, welcome to the LandMinds podcast.
Well, thanks so much to both of you for the invitation to be with you today, and a warm welcome to your entire audience as well. So basically, an epigrapher is someone who works with ancient texts, and in my particular field, I work especially with Semitic texts, especially Hebrew, Phoenician, Aramaic, Moabite, Ammonite, even Ugaritic and Akkadian, and then I also work in Greek and Latin and Coptic as well.
I'm so sorry. I was looking for somebody to do Edomite. If that's, I missed it.
Oh no, it's in there too. So
it's in there. Okay.
I do Moabite, Edomite, and Ammonite as well. So all of these are good.
I had a friend who was an Australian epigrapher, and he studied Vegemite. So it's all good. It's all good.
Yeah, very good. Sounds terrific. And so that's the focus. I work primarily on First Temple period and Second Temple inscriptions. And so inscriptions from various sites, places such as Arad, Hatzor, Jerusalem, of course, Lachish, Samaria, and also places, inscriptions from places such as Lebanon, modern Jordan. And so that's my field. And recently there was a conference at the Museum of the Bible, and the focus of that was a corpus, a small corpus of fragmentary inscriptions, which are indeed modern forgeries, not ancient texts.
When we talk about fragments, we're talking about incredibly small pieces. Maybe elaborate exactly of what the context of those materials are.
Right, so these are small pieces, and they were purported to have come through the hands of the Kondo family. This, of course, was the antiquities dealer who was responsible for brokering a lot of the deals with regard to the early scrolls in the 1940s and 1950s. And so these pieces, there's 16 in number that are part of the collection of the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. And they were purportedly from that same corpus of inscriptions that surfaced in the 1940s and the 1950s.
We've had them the whole time. We never sold them till now.
So that was the story, and it seemed specious at first blush to many people, including me, and indeed this turned not to be the case. That is to say, these are actually forgeries. The script has some serious problems. The ink doesn't pattern in the way it should, and also the laboratory tests were definitive in demonstrating that these are indeed modern forgeries. So epigraphers had suggested this previously. There had been some previous laboratory tests as well, but the most recent tests were exhaustive tests funded by the Museum of the Bible, and the determination is that it's decisive. These are all 16 of these fragments, about the size of the palm of your hand, sometimes smaller, sometimes perhaps slightly larger, but they're all modern forgeries.
So for our viewers, you can read Professor Rollston's blog. He writes on these issues, and it goes back years. You can learn a lot from that. National Geographic put out a piece, an article on it, and you can even watch the conference, and you can watch the different scholars and experts show the leather and go through these things. Now, Professor Rollston, you've raised that every time such a process happens, the forgers learn, oh, don't write it that way. Oh, don't use, oh, make sure to do this. And that means that through this publication, because it was in a public forum and not private, it means that everything gets tougher, as you wrote. But
Bernard, maybe
still
let's
worth doing?
Bernard, let's take a half a step back. What aroused people's suspicions about these fragments to begin with?
Right, so very good. So from the very beginning, there were concerns about these. Of course, as you know, they were purportedly from the Kondo family's collection. So that sort of suggested to some that these were legitimate. They were not a breach of the UNESCO convention. They could legally be purchased. So there was that aura of authenticity to them, but very rapidly, some scholars began to raise suspicions about them. There were anomalies in the script that were noted, some very fine points that were problematic, and there were enough of those, that is to say, a constellation of anomalies, a small constellation of anomalies, and that raised suspicion. And at that point, it was suggested that there should be laboratory tests performed. And initially, there were laboratory tests performed a couple of years ago on about 5 of these. Those laboratory tests suggested that those 5 were forged, modern forgeries. And then these most recent and very exhaustive laboratory tests performed by a really wonderful organization, Art Fraud Insights, pulling together a constellation of very fine hard scientists. And the conclusion is irrefutable. These are indeed modern forgeries, and the forger made a number of mistakes at the physical level. So not just with the script, but with regard to physical features of these fragments as well.
Is it accurate to say, before we go back to my original question, is it accurate to say that this is the most comprehensive battery of tests and assembly of scholars brought to bear on such an issue?
I would say that if we're talking about the epigraphic analysis, there have been previous forgeries that have garnered even more attention.
The range of scientific tests, the range of different disciplines brought to bear. That's what I mean.
But if we're talking about laboratory tests, this was, from my perspective, with regard to any ancient epigraphic remain, the most exhaustive set of tests and the most decisive set of tests which have been performed on epigraphic materials in the modern period. So this was really a fine piece of work using the most sophisticated of laboratory analyses.
So the museum went, as you mentioned in your article, the museum went from, and in previous articles, everybody, you bought things, it was done in a sly way, it was packaged as if it was art materials or other things, and it was actually antiquities, and they were caught, and they've paid millions of dollars, and they've sent things back. And here, the pendulum swing, they spent a lot of money, proved that they have forgeries, and shared that publicly, not privately. And that is a tikkun, that is a repair, and right, they're doing repentance, right? And you even suggest that they should make an exhibit of it, but are your comments on that?
Right, I think Tycoon that's a priceless word, and I think it's indeed the correct word here. So basically, we want to parse something out. So they bought a lot of antiquities on the antiquities market, including a large number of tablets and seals. Those were pillaged recently from the Middle East, and those were deeply problematic, were breaches of national and international laws, and the Department of Justice came down hard on them. They had to return all of those, and they also were fined several $1 million. So that's on the one hand, that's a corpus, most of which is Mesopotamian material culture. Now, these fragments of Dead Sea Scrolls are entirely different in all sorts of ways. First of all, they were putatively legal to purchase because they had putatively been in the Kondo family hands since the 40s and 50s. And
That's the source. I mean, if you're going to go and get Dead Sea Scrolls, you want to go to the guys whose name means we discovered Dead Sea Scrolls. You don't get, so to speak, better than that.
You don't, but Kando had a lack of candor.
Correct.
Right. There's no doubt about that. That the forger knew full well that if he could actually posit that these had been in the possession of the Kondo family or the Kando family for all of these years, that the chain of custody was irrefutable and secure. The problem, of course, is that that was not the case. And frankly, indeed, the Kondo family either was duped or they were complicit.
It's such a significant difference, right?
Those are the only two options as I see it.
We've actually interviewed someone many years ago who was very aware of the Kando family story. And even in the 40s and late 40s, early 50s, there were questions about who was Kando. So there were apparently 3 members of the same family who all claimed to be the Kando who had discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. So right from the beginning, there have been questions as to the identity of the person or people involved, and not just what was a very lucrative position as a middleman for trading in artifacts of antiquity in Jerusalem's Old City, which still goes on to this day to some degree.
Right. What I would say is that the person who actually brokered the deal, you know, we know his first name, we know his last name, we know who he was. There was just one of that person. And so we know that. Of course, it's a broader family, so I'm sure that many people asserted that they were part of the equation during the process of this. But the main point is that this notion that there were still scrolls out in the hands of the Kendo family. This has been something that's been part of the equation and part of the lore of Dead Sea scholars for a long time, and the lore of Dead Sea scholarship for a long time. So that's definitely the case. And the forger knew that, right? The forger knew that if forgers do this all the time, they create a putative chain of custody. They talk about the putative place where the artifacts or the inscriptions were found. They often come up with this lore about the hands that they have passed through, the scholars who have seen them and verified the authenticity. And they use all of that to raise the price which they can request for these objects. So the modus operandi is very well.
Sorry.
Very clear. I want to focus on the forge in a minute, but I'd like to come back to the new challenge. We've just upped the ante of what it takes to forge properly, and we've helped the forgers in their business. On the one hand, we made it harder, don't do that. On the other hand, I now know what I have to do to come across it, and the physical capabilities are still there, or do you think the testing can now catch things reliably? But not everybody's going to spend the money that the Museum of the Bible did. What's the new situation, the new playing field in your eyes?
This has always been a game of cat and mouse. It's been this way since, well, for the past century and a half, really. It's been a game of cat and mouse. So basically, modern forgers have always read our articles. They've purchased and read our books, and they also attend our conferences. And so every time a forgery is debunked, as scholars, we have to provide enough evidence to demonstrate that this is indeed a modern forgery. We have to give that evidence to our colleagues so that they actually understand that it is. Because one of the problems is a fair number of scholars, sometimes fairly good scholars, have actually argued for the authenticity of some pretty bad modern forgeries. So one of the things we have to do as scholars is provide enough evidence to convince the rest of the field that a piece is indeed a modern forgery. That's good. That's also very bad, because the forgers read the articles, they realize the mistakes that they can't make if they wish to be undetected, and the next time they produce a forgery, they improve the quality. That has to do with the epigraphic side of it, that is to say the way the letters are formed, the number of strokes used to form a letter, the sequence of the strokes used to form a letter. You know, that's my field, that's what I work in, and yet when I reveal that information about a forgery and the problems with those sorts of things, it educates the forger. The same thing is true with regard to these laboratory tests. These laboratory tests are superb, they are highly detailed, and they now educate the forgers so that the forgers know if they are going to be able to garner hundreds of thousands, and even, as in the case of these Dead Sea Scroll forgeries, millions of dollars, they know that they have to up their game, and they actually know precisely how they have to up their game so as to produce something that's not detectable.
Do you think it can still be done? Do you know how to make something that would, don't tell me how, but do you feel that you know how something can be forged that would get past all of the battery of tests that were just used now?
For sure.
Really? Wow.
No, and wow. I mean, this occurs in the field of, think about it, in the field of art forgeries, right? Renaissance art forgeries, these still are produced. And if there's enough money on the table, I don't care what it is, if there's enough money on the table, someone can actually produce a perfect forgery. And have this sort of data out there now, the forgers will read over it. Now, what it will ensure is the next time someone attempts to forge a Dead Sea Scroll, they're going to be more careful about the medium. That is to say, they'll actually get real parchment, not shoe leather. So they know that they can't make that mistake. And they also know some things about the patterning of the ink, some mistakes that they can't make next time. But if there's enough money on the table, absolutely it can be done. It can be done with regard to Renaissance art or any other period for that matter. And it can be done with regard to inscriptions. And so this report is tremendous. And the Museum of the Bible, I suppose, felt that it was necessary to release the whole report so as to demonstrate that they were entirely transparent,
yeah,
entirely clean.
Their whole existence is predicated on the authenticity of what they're presenting.
Yeah, so they felt they had to give the entire report. They had to release it, and in many ways I applaud that. But I actually did mention to the lab that was responsible for these, I said, you know, the problem is that this will educate the forgers. Not everybody agrees. Some people think that no forger would be able to produce a perfect forgery. And I think that that's a wonderful notion. I wish that it were true. I wish that it were true with regard to currency that we use in our various countries. I wish it were true with regard to art. But the fact of the matter is that a really fine forger of something a really fine forger continues to have the things necessary to produce better and better forgeries. It's just, so it's a game of cat and mouse. So this debunked a series of them. It'll also educate the next, this forger or some other forger the next time around.
I appreciate it, but this interview was worth it.
A little bit,
yeah.
Right? We have an item that's been sitting for many years already in the Israel Museum, the Ivory Pomegranate, which is in every book about ancient inscriptions. It's been there, and it's still debated. It's still, there are those people who say, no, the thing is 100% authentic, and there's other people who say, no, we're not so sure. There's some questions here. right? So the scholars are still debating the issue of whether or not this item, which in the initial stages for sure was front and center in the museum's presentation of the history of Israel, this is one of the premier items. And on the other hand, today we're calling into question literally everything that museums have in their collections. And sometimes it's very difficult to know for sure one way or the other. Can you comment about that?
Yeah, what I would say is with regard to the Ivory Pomegranate, the consensus opinion in the field is that that's a forgery, that the inscription is a forgery. And I don't think there's too much doubt about that. I've looked at it twice microscopically at the Israel Museum. And I've argued in print, actually, in a Festschrift article honoring Joseph Navat, the late, great Joseph Navat, that that's a forgery, and there are a number of people before me who've argued the same thing.
What about Herschel Shanks saying, what about the hay that's in the crack? He kept on saying, what about the hay?
I say that this is a red herring, right? Herschel's a very fine person. He's a friend. He has a very fine law degree from Harvard. But fascinatingly enough, this doesn't make Herschel a dear friend whom I like very, very much. It doesn't actually make Herschel an epigrapher. And so the consensus opinion with regard to the ivory pomegranate is that the pomegranate itself is ancient, probably late Bronze Age, although no carbon-14 test has been done on it yet, but that the inscription itself is a forgery. And I argue that at length in that.
Right, no, that's what I was asking. He always say, what about that hay? That was a specific question, but yeah.
Yeah, right. He made something about the hay, and I think he was making a mountain out of a molehill. It's not an issue. The piece is bad.
Okay. Or he was just making hay.
That's why it's no longer on exhibit at the Israel Museum.
Okay. Right. Continue. That was an example. You were going to continue.
Yeah. So right there. One of the things that I'd say is that there have always been good scholars who've been happy to authenticate inscriptions that turn out to be forgeries. And one of the things that I would say is some people are good at detecting anomalies and weighing those anomalies and then rendering a verdict. And some people in the field just aren't good at that. And that's just the way it is. And so there is a long list of scholars who've actually gone in print and argued for the authenticity of some inscriptions, which I consider to be fairly average to poor modern forgeries.
Really?
Yeah, well, let me give you a concrete example. There were some inscriptions that were putatively found in Hebron. They were called the Hebron Philistine inscriptions, discovered in the late 1960s, and they were published in preliminary fashion by George Mendenhall in the Annual of the Department of Antiquities of Jordan. And he argued that they were authentic. Frank Cross had mentioned in an SBL meeting when they were first presented that these looked a lot like the Siloam Tunnel inscription, and Cross said, I believe they're bad. Mendenhall persisted without mentioning Cross's name, made some caustic statements about Cross in print, repudiating Cross's views. Navat later wrote an article, Joseph Navat later wrote an article and demonstrated that these inscriptions, which Mendenhall had argued were authentic inscriptions, Navat demonstrated that these were the Siloam Tunnel inscription written backwards. It was a forger's joke, but it had fooled a very fine scholar, namely Mendenhall. I have all sorts of examples of that. I've detailed a number of those in print in various articles, and I have a book coming out on the subject of the long history of forgery, but there are all sorts of examples of that. And one can think about recent examples of this sort of thing as well, including with regard to these Dead Sea Scroll forgeries, yes?
Right.
I won't mention names with regard to these.
The psychology here is fascinating because if I'm a scholar and I really want this inscription to be real, it's very hard to dispassionately turn off my desire and suddenly say, I'm going to look at this dispassionately and critically, as opposed to, wow, look what we have in our hands. Look what I have to say about this item. There's the personal investment of maybe a whole career, right, based on one small sample of writing, right, that now suddenly I can anchor everything I think about this field in this one item.
And Malcolm Gladwell raised this in Blink. You know, the investment, we have this piece, and the Getty, the first look, his example of this phenomenon was experts with a forgery of an archaeological object and the difference of that look, or I've already invested in it, so how can I go back?
Yep. Yeah, and that's sort of another piece of this. So what I would say is that forgers absolutely know what people want.
Yeah.
And they give that to them, right? And forgers also know what certain scholars want. They also know which scholars have actually argued for certain positions, and they need a piece of evidence. So if you give a scholar who's not disinterested, believes that he may be disinterested, but is really not disinterested in a subject, an inscription, and it actually helps to prove the case the scholar has argued in the past in print, you can see that that's a very enticing thing. So forgers are very savvy. And in the field, people have often assumed that forgers are basically buffoons and dolts. And in fact, I would argue that forgers are really pretty good at script. They're pretty good at orthography, that is to say spelling. They have at least a high school knowledge of chemistry, and they have a great deal of understanding of social intelligence, and they know precisely what the public wants, and they also know precisely what certain scholars want, and they even know the very scholars they need to go to have a piece they've forged or they're brokering authenticated, right? Forgers know this, and dealers know this. And so there's a long history of this. It's very clear. I've outlined it multiple times in print. So it's a fascinating phenomenon, and there is a psychological component to this for sure.
I want to zero in on this with you in a second, but you must hear the story. I'm sitting, I think W were there also. We're sitting at Shlomo Mosayev's table in Herzliya, and a rabbi is reading a ancient Kabbalistic book of a student of the famous Baal Shem Tov. And they say, Shlomo, I have the sword of Palti ben Laish that Jewish tradition says he put into the bed between him and Michal. Would you like it? He said, sure. The rabbi looked up. He said, what? You know, it's a joke. But of course. But
yeah, that's
Shlomo
right.
Mosayev could look at an item and he could go, this is real, this is a fake, in a second. And I would put my money on his ability to identify a fake. Probably.
I wouldn't, because he said, I enjoy the fakes. I don't mind if I buy some. I
That's
wouldn't.
true, but he knew which ones were the fakes.
As a rule of thumb, I'll agree with you. But Chris, let's zero in now, because you're preparing for classes. You're actually working. We'd like to hear about that right before we close. But what do you think is happening here? Who is the forger? What type of person is it? This is unbelievable. Let's hear the detective aspect. What do you think is going on here?
Very good. Let me first answer the previous comment from David. What I would say is Shlomo Mosayev was probably fairly good, but case in point, in other words, I like concrete details. Case in point, the two Mosayev ostraca that I debunked as modern forgeries, Mosayev thought were ancient. So what I would say is Mosayev probably had a decent sense. I think he could detect obvious forgeries fairly well. Good forgeries would fool him all day long. And those
I think you're probably right. I think
and
you're probably right.
Right, and the two Musaev ostraca, which were debunked, are really, they're not bad forgeries, but the forger made a number of mistakes. Musaev didn't see them. He thought they were good, and he missed something, which from my perspective is fairly obvious with regard to those pieces.
You know, he was dyslexic. He took a mental picture of it and then reviewed things in his mind. It's unbelievable what he was able to do. But
I think you're right. And certainly on the microscopic level, he didn't have the capacity to be able to look at something like
the jeweler's loop
or under a patina and be able to determine what was going on.
Right, and that brings up another point. When I look at inscriptions, I look at them microscopically. I actually look, if it's an ink inscription, to see which strokes, which form a letter are first, which ones are second, which ones are on top of or under other strokes, the direction of the strokes. I measure the angle of the strokes in Photoshop. I archive all of that data. And when I look at a piece, when I see all sorts of anomalies, not just one, not just two, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 anomalies, that's when I decide that this piece can be placed in the category of forgery. So that's good. So now let's go on, as you suggest, Barnea, to the subject of the forger of these pieces. So the forger of these pieces considers himself quite brilliant. He obviously believed that he could dupe all scholars, really. The forger of these pieces is someone familiar with Dead Sea Scrolls texts, the good ones. I believe the forger of these pieces teaches at a university.
Really?
Yes, for sure.
We don't really have former forgers who are sitting in jail or did their time. For the most part, these guys usually get away scot-free.
They do. So I think the forger of these is a scholar. I think that he's someone intimately familiar with Dead Sea Scrolls. I think that he's hubristic. I think that he's venal. I think that he's also not as good as he previously believed. And I think that there's enough evidence here that can be ascertained and demonstrated in an empirical manner to out this forger, and this is what I absolutely hope happens.
Wow. So notes, if I was playing Clue, right, I line up, here are the university scholars of X amount of quality. There aren't, I'm going to make a guess, there are not 50 Dead Sea Scroll scholars in the world on this level. Is that a correct statement?
You said 50?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Far fewer.
Far fewer. So, you know.
No, you have all these little universities who have their scholar on staff who knows a little bit.
Yes, but this is a different level. This is an intimate level of knowledge of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This goes beyond and knowledge of the materials and the context and everything. That's why Professor Rollston is saying it's a university scholar. So you could make a game of Clue out of this. You know, we could do an online, but it's just it's shaming people. It's to be very careful. But you think it's discoverable and you think it's university scholar, which is frightening because that means that the not just the intellectual honesty, the entire sense of giving over humanity's values, history, the tools, the meaning is all internally flawed. It's not toho kaboro. The inside is not like the outside in Talmudic sense. It's somebody who's teaching this, but actually is not.
Right. There are a couple of things that I would mention in this connection. I should have noted as well that I believe the forger of these has a history of dealing in and with the antiquities market. So that's something else that I would mention in terms of the profile of this scholar. So I've given you a very thorough profile, and it's a small list of people who actually fit the profile.
You fit that profile.
The other thing that I would mention is that, right, just as you're suggesting, sometimes people presuppose, and George Mendenhall, who was a great scholar, but not an epigrapher, actually fell into this trap as well. He actually said in print that no one, with regard to the Hebron Philistine documents, he said no one with the ability to forge these would forge these, ergo, therefore, these are good. That was part of his rationale.
Who would go to this trouble?
No, who would not be with the integrity? If you have this level of learning, then I'm assuming integrity, nobody would betray that integrity. That's what he meant.
That's exactly what he meant. And so what I think is that's a beautiful, sorry. So that's, sorry about that. So
I can pause the recording if you want.
yeah, yeah. Oh, no, it's okay. Go ahead. We can continue.
Go ahead.
Very good. So with regard to the subject of forgers, one of the things that Mendenhall believed, therefore, with regard to the Hebron Philistine documents, and various other people have suggested the same thing with regard to various other modern forgeries, that no one who's educated in the field would ever do something which is so amoral and so immoral. And the fact of the matter is that's a beautiful romantic notion of what an education can do for someone, but practically speaking, we know it's not the case. Let me give you a concrete example. A Princeton professor named Coleman Norton actually forged an inscription in the middle of the 20th century and published it in Catholic Biblical Quarterly. He entitled it, rather cleverly, an amusing agraphon, and he was outed by his own doctoral student, former doctoral student, Bruce Metzger, who wrote an article that was published in the Journal of Biblical Literature, noting that Coleman Norton had actually forged this. He was a Princeton professor, Coleman Norton was. And I use that story to remind people that even people with
impeccable degrees.
Yep, even people trained in the field can go to the side, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
I think that's important as well. So people in my field have sometimes assumed, especially a previous generation of scholars, have previously assumed that this just wouldn't occur, that no one trained in the field would do such a thing. And I think that's beautiful. I think it's a wonderfully romantic view of humanity and of the virtues of education. But I'm a realist with regard to all things. And the fact of the matter is, the Coleman Norton case demonstrates in an ironclad fashion, someone at a very fine university could indeed produce a forgery.
More to talk on that, but you said that you are preparing for class. Can we have a word on what is happening with you and your students? How is George Washington University responding right now to learning going on with these conditions?
George Washington University is doing well, and we're now teaching online totally for the remainder of the academic year. And there was an onboarding process for us. We were given seminars in the various platforms which we could use for online teaching. There's definitely a learning curve. And I spent last week during my break making sure that I could transfer to online learning. Yesterday was our first day of, or my first day, I should say, of teaching courses entirely online. So I started out by teaching Biblical Hebrew online. Then I taught my Hebrew Scriptures lecture course online. Then I taught a course entitled Latin for Lawyers online. And then I taught Hellenistic Greek online, and all went well. So this is definitely an interesting time, but we'll get through this. And George Washington University will, and I believe all universities will step up to the plate. So this is definitely difficult, and it's required some rapid transitioning, but where there's a will, there's a way. I'm an eternal optimist with regard to this sort of thing.
And in terms of the students?
Optimistic note, Marnea, sorry?
And in terms of the students?
The students are actually doing really well. Yeah, I have some small classes, of course, the more arcane language classes, and then the Hebrew Scriptures course is a fairly large course. They're actually doing really well. They're actually comfortable with these platforms. they're helpful even to us in terms of telling us certain ways to maximize the benefits of the software. So they're, at least at George Washington University, in the courses I have and the students I have, they are really stepping up to the plate. They have good attitudes about this. And I've been really gratified by the ways in which this has occurred. So this is difficult for everyone, but I truly believe that we'll get through this together. Everybody, it seems to me, is putting one foot in front of the other, taking this one day at a time, and moving forward in spite of these things.
I think it will help things to flourish further. David, do we have time for one more question?
That's a question for Dr. Rollston. You know, I don't want to push him. Maybe there we should leave something for the future.
Yeah, tell you what, one thing that I would like to mention as well is this. I think that there's an urgent need for very fine epigraphers of Hebrew and Aramaic and Phoenician to be trained. The older generation has lost some giants. I think from my perspective, because of my personal appreciation and respect and friendship with Joseph Navet, the late Joseph Navet of Hebrew University. And I also think of my deep affection and admiration and respect and friendship with Frank Cross. And both of those scholars, now of blessed memory, left a dramatic impact on the field. And I hope that the current generation of scholars is doing the same, the current generation of epigraphers. But frankly, with so many universities teaching inscriptions, Hebrew inscriptions, Aramaic inscriptions, Phoenician inscriptions, Moabite, Ammonite inscriptions, Edomite inscriptions, so much less than used to be the case. And at a more superficial level, I fear for the fact that this really essential field for archaeology won't have the critical infrastructure it needs for the next generation. So I would love to see universities start making sure that the field of epigraphy is taught for a number of reasons. First of all, it's an important field. It's a subset of archaeology. We assist archaeologists by reading inscriptions. This is helpful for creating better constructs of history and language, cultures, all aspects. But also, it is a good way of having a generation of people ready to debunk the next group of forgers who are getting better all the time. So in other words, they're getting better. We really better get better as well. So we desperately need a new generation of scholars.
That's fantastic. My question to you was going to be, what do you feel is a contribution that's needed to the field? So thank you for dealing with that. I caught Professor Benjamin Zass in his last years before he went to retirement. Aaron Dembski went to retirement. The people with decades behind them are not there, and it's hard to find somebody to fill in. Maybe some online courses that you would give through university that people would pay for, and maybe in the general public, or become more of interest. That's the thought that came to my mind as you were speaking. But thank you for these words, and we'll look to encourage it. David, closing remarks?
No, I think this was fantastic. Thank you very much. It just whets my appetite for more. And we want to thank you for taking from your sedentary now lifestyle, right, that we're all enjoying together. You know, this was a fabulous experience for us. What I would say is, you know, stay with it. You know, if you can inspire one student, which I think you do anyway, inspire one person, that's one more person. But I agree with you. It's not, you know, it's not, epigraphy is not given its due weight, because sometimes the only window into the past that is unique in an excavation, a small excavation or a large excavation, can be learned through the epigraphy, as opposed to many of the things that are very common at other sites. So thank you for the time. This is David Wilner.
and Bernays Levy-Sullivan. We thank Professor Christopher Rollston from the Department of Classical Near Eastern Language Civilizations, George Washington University. Chris, it was fantastic. Thank you so much, and much success in these trying times, stepping up.
Okay, thanks so much. Lahitrot.
Be well. Over
Okay,
now.
all right, bye-bye now.